Good morning. These are the diehards. Every hurdle that nature and humankind could have produced for you today was overcome by this group. So thank you for being here. My name is Jane Wales. I'm vice president here, and I lead a program called Philanthropy and Social Innovation. Most of all, I'm just here to welcome you, to acknowledge a few people who made this all possible. Of course, Tracy of Social Finance, who will be, I'll be turning this over to in a minute, but Kippy Joseph of Rockefeller Foundation has been supporting us here throughout in our impact investing program, and Rosita of a Mid-Year Network. Rosita Najmi has been a stalwart supporter of us as well. And this is a sub-program for which the godfather or the midwife or whatever you want to say. There's always some connotation that I have to watch out for. But Jonathan Greenblatt played that role. And so he really developed this strand of our work here. I also have to, there's Randall Kempner of Aspen Network for Development Entrepreneurs, and Ann Mosley of Ascend, two really valued colleagues here. Let me just say a word. We've been collaborating with Andy every chance we can get, and we have a specific collaboration initiated by Ann Mosley at Ascend to undertake a study to take a look at how impact investing can be used, or what the experience is thus far, in trying to break the cycle of poverty, that sort of intergenerational transfer of policy of poverty that is so much a reality in our lives. And this is Ann's passion; it's her life's work. And she very graciously reached out to us to collaborate on that, and the report will be presented at the Aspen Philanthropy Group in early August, and then released. The final report will be released in the fall of this year, right? Okay, so anyway, this is an opportunity to release a very important study by Social Finance. It's a particular pleasure to work with Social Finance. I have lots of different different touch points with Social Finance and with Tracy, so it's a personal pleasure as well. The focus is going to be, as you know, on the role of foundations in the impact bond space, and I think this is a very important report. So I turn it over to Tracy.
I will be very brief. Thank you so much. See how technologically advanced I am. Thank you, all of you, road warriors, for joining us. I know many people endured trains, planes, and automobiles, not least Bill, who took the train from Boston, and Surya, that almost gave up and finally found a flight from Dallas last night. And for all of you for coming this morning to join us. Several people to thank, in addition to the fantastic work that Tracy and her team and Aspen, and for that very warm and kind introduction, Jane, and for hosting us today, as well as Laura and her team at the Council of Foundations for bringing this event to the attention of folks in your network, and not least all of you and all the folks, as Jane said, the midwives of this report, the people that we interviewed, reviewers, and all the other thought leaders that made this report possible. And I think it's quite snazzy. Anyway, I am not going to say too much because the stars of the conversation are to my left, and I really want to give them ample time. But I do want to say something. Ironically, this report was ready to be released at the end of last summer. In fact, Jane and her co-author Jill on our team started the report almost a year ago. But then we were prohibited from launching the paper because our lawyers and our friends at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, because we were doing a private placement offering for the New York State transaction, that we were under securities regulation and we were in a quiet period, and we could not engage with the public in this fashion. And so what do? We turned the situation into lemonade, and which I think ultimately in hindsight is a blessing, because in the ensuing months since September, the field has genuinely transformed. At the end of last summer, we still had one deal on the ground, which is the New York City Rikers Island project. And just in the last couple of months, we're seeing almost $50 million of capital flowing into the space, making the United States the largest social impact bond pay-for-success market in the world, much to the chagrin of our UK colleagues. You know, a little bit of a competitive spirit is a good thing. And the pipeline is extremely robust, and we're seeing experiments being done in different social issue areas beyond recidivism. We're seeing a lot of interest from red to blue to purple states. We're seeing very different financial structures emerging if you compare the different transactions on the ground. We're seeing the role of philanthropy, you know, fingers in all the deals, but playing very different roles, and a discussion that will be followed by the panel. And this ultimately remains a delicate experiment, and we're all in this together, but the momentum in the last few months have given us just a lot of excitement, though very, very mindful of the significant challenges still ahead of us, and how do we ultimately make sure that the introduction of, you know, financial benefit remains a force for good, and do not lead us to a road of unintended consequences. And that's why our friends in the foundation role is particularly important in keeping us honest and making sure that we stay true to our mission. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jane, who is one of the co-authors of this report, alongside Jill Scherer. Jane is the Director of Knowledge Management on our team, and Jane has a background in academia and finance, and actually will be publishing her third or fourth book called Scandals on Wall Street, which we anticipate social impact bonds not to touch. So with that, here you go, Jane.
Thanks. Thanks, and, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Thanks again to everybody, in particular our partners at Aspen Institute and Tracy and her team, who have just been fabulous to work with. It's a great pleasure to be here. I just have to say one thing, though. In Boston, we have 4 seasons. We have almost winter, winter, still winter, and road work. So I was really excited to be in D.C. and experience springtime. Thanks. So I'm just going to set the stage for the panel discussion by going through the key findings of this paper very quickly, which I co-authored with my colleague Jill Scherer. And I think, first of all, it's important to establish a clarity of purpose around this paper, what it is, and just as importantly, what it's actually not. The paper is the result of months, more months than we anticipated, of research, including dozens of interviews with leaders of foundations, thought leaders, financial institutions, nonprofit organizations, and these folks that we spoke with were at various levels of engagement with the market, from the very deeply skeptical to the very deeply involved. We really tried to involve folks from all ends of that spectrum. But what it's not, it is not a random sample of foundations in the U.S. It is nowhere near a random sample. The goal was to collect the early learnings of those who pioneered this market and to bring them together for the benefit of those who may be interested in going further into the market. And we're very careful not to extrapolate our findings to the broader world of foundations. I think that's very important to state. As one of our interviewees said, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. So with that very big caveat, what did we learn from this research? Well, we learned that foundations have chosen to get involved in a lot of different ways and for a lot of different reasons. First, we found that what attracts foundations to SIBs? Well, the potential to shift funding from remediation to prevention was often cited. One interviewee said, governments have not had the luxury of taking the future into consideration. So SIBs focus on prevention rather than remediation. A lot of foundation partners talked about the ability to amplify impact by growing the pie for the social sector. Others talked about the focus on outcomes rather than inputs or outputs, rather than head count, you know, how many people were in a program, what they actually derived from the program and what the outcomes were. Many also were interested in the ability of SIBs to drive public accountability and efficiency by pushing government to focus on what actually works and to direct resources to what actually works. Others talked about the ability to deploy capital through program-related investments, or PRIs. That was very important to some foundations. And finally, we heard a lot from folks about the importance of foundations' role as, quote-unquote, an idea shop, that they take on the risk of proving a concept. They have the ability to take on this risk before it can be scaled up by government. One interviewee said, I liked this, "We have the charge to underwrite innovation, to test new models in ways that are much harder for other actors like government." So with these motives in mind, then, how did foundations choose to engage? How did they engage with SIBs? And that we bucketed into three categories, really. The first was making grants, and those grants were used to support capacity building, underwrite research, support demonstration projects like our own project in Fresno, California, and of course mitigate risk through credit enhancement, which we saw in Bloomberg Philanthropy's support of the Rikers Island SIB. The second bucket was investing directly in SIBs through program-related investments, through PRIs. And an example of that is the Laura and John Arnold Foundation's philanthropic investment in our New York State transaction. And then the third bucket is to use the power of foundations to bring people together, to foster partnerships, to produce convenings like this one, or like the Pritzker Family Foundation is sponsoring a convening in March around the use of PFS for early childhood education. So those are the three buckets. With all of that said, there's been a lot of flurry and attention to the sector. We're all here today. But a lot of the folks that we spoke with also talked about their concerns about the hype about in this sector, that some are maybe rushing into the SIB market without enough data. Another one cautioned against overselling the potential benefits of SIBs. Many talked about the steep learning curve. SIBs are not simple. They're very complex instruments, and there is a steep learning curve associated with getting involved, getting engaged with them. Even the terminology of SIB is still contentious, as many of you probably know. Some say that the SIB term is well established at this point. Another described it as releasing an apple into the world and calling it an orange. So, many are frustrated by the long lead time and unexpected complexity of early SIB transactions. And on a broader level, some folks voiced concern that SIBs could divert attention from larger, more systemic reforms. One asked, are SIBs part of a larger conversation about what it will take to sustain a safety net going forward? So finally, in terms of the way forward for this market, our interviews did show a lot of uncertainty around the long-term vision for the SIB market. One commented, if foundations are providing very significant guarantees on private investment, then when will we get beyond this initial stage to a very clear-eyed investment? Several actually used the same phrase. They called credit enhancements training wheels, and looked forward to the time when those would be unnecessary. So I would like to conclude with just a couple of comments that we found at the end of all of this research. First of all, we feel strongly that foundations bring much more than capital to the SIB market. They also bring knowledge, integrity, and partnerships that are deeply valuable, and we hope that they will remain engaged for the long term. We envision a future in which mainstream impact investors, governments, and foundations continue to co-fund SIB transactions. And one notion that we would toss out is that, as many of you know, it's fairly straightforward to quantify, for example, cost savings from managing asthma so that kids don't wind up in emergency rooms. Those cost savings are fairly straightforward to quantify. What's much less straightforward to quantify is the benefit to the child and to society from not missing school because they're in the hospital due to an asthma attack. In Fresno, California, the #1 health-related reason why kids miss school is asthma. So those less easy to quantify benefits may signal a role for foundations to move forward in the market. Perhaps commercial investors fund the easier to quantify benefits associated with cost savings, and foundations co-fund to account for the less easily quantifiable broader social benefits. And that underlines what is to us the core strength of the SIB model, which is its ability to facilitate uncommon partnerships in pursuit of a common goal. So at this point, I will turn it over to Tracy to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Jane, for presenting our findings. And I want to pick up on your last line, Jane, that the social impact bond really represents an uncommon partnership among very diverse parties in pursuit of a common goal. And ultimately, finance is simply a means to an end. And the end is about improved lives. In fact, it is a very improvement of lives that generates the investment alpha. And that is the elegance of the SIB. And with that, I'd like to introduce really the organizations that is the underlying asset of this security, which are the nonprofit providers who are toiling in and day out to serve the end client to make sure that their lives improve. And it is my pleasure to introduce the Nurse Family Partnership, which is one of the most evidence-based, rigorous, well-managed organizations that we've encountered, and this is a partnership that we value deeply. I will let Tamar Bauer, who is the Chief Policy and Government Affairs Officer at NFP, but more importantly, Tamar is really the czar of PFS over at the Nurse Family Partnership. She makes everything happen, and your stewardship of this process to allow NFP to go into this space has just been extraordinary, and I know my colleague Nirav Shah really appreciate your partnership in all this effort. So with that, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Tracy, for that incredibly warm introduction. I will just say that on behalf of my boss, Tom Jenkins, and me and the team that works on NFP, the sentiment is completely shared. We think you guys have been incredible partners in stewarding us down this very complex path, as you know. This has not been simple. It was not straightforward to us, and we've just been incredibly valuable for the learning and partnership with you. So thank you, Tracy. I'll start with just a story to bring us to why we're focusing on this. Amanda was just a child when she first suffered abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional, at the hands of several of her mother's boyfriends who went through her house throughout her childhood. Her young life was obviously hard. As a teen, she was homeless, and at 16, Amanda became pregnant with the first boy who paid her any attention, according to her telling. As is too often the case, that man was abusive as well. After Amanda's baby was born, the child's father continued to beat Amanda, and one day he held her over the baby's crib and he choked her. Amanda thought she was going to die, and her thought was, this will be the last vision, the last image, and the last time that my son will ever see me. Fortunately, Amanda survived, and she got out. She got out with the help of a specially trained nurse who works with young women like Amanda. So obviously the reason I'm telling you about Amanda is that the nurse who helped her is one of ours. Amanda is one of thousands of young mothers that Nurse Family Partnership, or NFP, has helped. So in a nutshell, we have specially trained nurses who make home visits with young women living in poverty or having their first baby. These are young women, sometimes as young as 13 or 14. I've met several of them who are that young. They've come on Hill visits with me, and it's striking the level of poise and assurance that they have as they tell their stories. And they have very little, certainly not an understanding of how to parent or a role model to follow. But they're motivated, and it's really striking. They're motivated to give their child more than they ever had. So I think you guys may all know that NFP nurses partner with mothers from very early in their pregnancy until the child reaches age 2. The 3 program goals are listed there. Does the program work? Yes, we believe we can answer that pretty definitively. We know NFP is one of the most studied programs of its kind. There are remarkable outcomes from 3 randomized controlled trials over 3 decades with 3 different population groups. Here are a couple of the outcomes from NFP. There are lots of others. And if you're thinking that these outcomes make for stronger families and save society money, it's been shown to be true. An economic analysis conducted by the RAND Corporation says the return on investment is $5.70 for every dollar invested in NFP to serve high-risk families. So based on the outcomes and based on the ROI, there are a long list of organizations that endorse NFP as a smart solution to some of society's toughest problems. In our states and in DC, NFP has been embraced by both sides of the aisle, and I'll say that's really been an intentional strategy on our part and on the part of our partners. We're grateful that both the Bush and Obama administrations have included funding in their budgets for evidence-based home visiting that was in many ways modeled after NFP. Today, NFP is in 43 states, 6 tribal organizations, and 1 territory, serving about 28,000 young moms. It's a good start, but we're really, obviously, scratching the surface. There are more than 500,000 first-birth babies born into poverty every year in America. It's a lot of people, and we want to be a solution to that problem. So NFP is needed in far more homes, shelters, and even prisons. While NFP has been studied in trials led by Dr. David Olds and his colleagues for 37 years, we've been a nonprofit business only for the last 10. And we were fortunate to receive tremendous startup capital from a team of foundations led by the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation. The Bill and Melinda Gates, Robert Wood Johnson, Kresge, Kellogg, Robertson, and JPP. These other foundations joined, and several others joined together as early co-investors in creating the infrastructure at the National Office to support quality replication. That generous capital got us started, and it gave us the gift of being able to focus on quality replication rather than fundraising. It's essential to how we got to the Pay for Success position we're in today. It's also money that was leveraged to generate tremendous bipartisan support and new money for states through what we call the McV program, the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program. So it's a great public-private partnership story, we believe. Let me just take a moment to show you how the model works. As a nonprofit, we relied on our initial startup growth capital, as I mentioned. We also earned fees from our states and agencies who are our customers. And going forward, we'll need comprehensive philanthropy as the startup growth capital is drawn down. Then at the states and implementing agency level, they use public money, and also they secure some private money as well to pay for NFP. And then NFP is free to our clients, as it should be. We believe that the Pay for Success market offers a viable growth strategy that is potentially a game changer for a whole number of reasons, many of which were mentioned in your report, but I'll just highlight 2 from our perspective. First, it has the potential to significantly increase the amount of capital available to scale a program, obviously. And second, we believe that the structure may make it possible to focus use of these increased funds on a smaller number of communities where the need is greatest, so really to target. So our recent experience with the federal McV program is illustrative. Based on government priorities, the major, or sizable federal investment of $1.5 billion over 5 years was the allocation of funds really was supported a mile-wide, inch-deep investment, which we understand and we support and we recognize, but we're looking for a way to scale in targeted communities. And we think that Pay for Success may be a structure that is a little less subject to political pressures and a little more focused on efficient and effective implementation to allow us to take it to the next step. We hope that's true because we want to take our program to scale and demonstrate the potential impact of our program at scale and to the population impact. So not only that we can demonstrate not only that we have an impact on individuals, but on communities and states. At the same time, we know there are risks, and there are quite a number of them, and we engaged in a deliberate and lengthy review of the risks and benefits with counsel from our social finance partners and others, and nonetheless determined that this is a prudent path that is well aligned with NFP's commitment to transparency and evidence-based practice. I'll say there are 2 risks that concern us the most, but we're still fully committed and going forward. And the 2 risks are really the reputational risk if we don't hit our outcomes, but we believe that we're going to get there. We're pretty confident that we'll be able to hit all those outcomes. But there's also the sustainability question. If we grow real fast, we're concerned about what's going to sustain the program, and that we're really for example, one of our principles with our agencies in the field is that we won't go forward with an agency until they have at least 3 years of money to support a program, because we don't want to start and stop programs. So I'll just say, in this evolving journey, we've been enormously grateful for the role that our foundation partners have played so far. And they've done a lot of different things. They've offered feedback on specific strategies that we've proposed for advancing pay for success. They've provided counsel on program design and outcome metrics. They provided operational readiness support to become SIB ready. And they basically helped us get smarter and more prepared for the next steps ahead. And while we've done intensive work internally and with our terrific partner Social Finance over the past months to develop the framework for an NFP SIB, we know that we're still at the beginning of our learning curve, and we really appreciate the support and guidance and intelligence that comes from reports like these in our journey. I want to leave you today with the continuation of Amanda's story. Today, just a few years after she nearly died, Amanda is thriving. She has earned an associate's degree. She has a full-time professional job. Her son is healthy, and he's doing really well at school. And Amanda is engaged to a young man that, as she puts it, would rather die than lay a hand on her. Her son is growing up in a home where there's love, and there's joy, and there's kindness. That's how every child's life should be, and I think that's probably what we all think in this room. Amanda told us her story, and she quietly said, "You have to understand. This all stops with me. My son's life will be different." So I appreciate your willingness to learn more about NFP as a solution. I appreciate your voice to advocate for what works, and I truly appreciate your care and concern about what happens to the most vulnerable among us. Thank you.
It's a hard act to follow, Tamar. Thank you so much for that inspiring story and those remarks. And you're the reason why we get up in the morning and do all this work. It's a true illustration of finance to serve society. So switching gears, we're going to have a lively discussion moderated by my good friend Kippy Joseph. Kippy has been a fellow traveler on this SIB journey from the very beginning. In fact, Kippy, as head of innovation at Rockefeller Foundation, funded our work in the UK and also funded alongside the Omidyar Network and the Pershing Square Foundation to bring this innovation to the United States and the creation of Social Finance US at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011 period. And 3 years ago, Kippy and I were knocking on doors and trying to explain what this animal called social impact bond is. And now we have folks like all of you in this room having a very nuanced and sophisticated discussion on the potential of this financing. I just wanted to highlight Kippy's role in enabling this market over the last 3 years and our gratitude to her extraordinary leadership and partnership. And exactly a week ago, I was sitting in the same room for an impact investing discussion hosted by Aspen, and Don Graves at Treasury talked about Jonathan Greenblatt, who is unfortunately is not able to be here, but Dave is speaking on his behalf. But Don talked about Jonathan's role in the impact investing and the pay for success space as that of Bob Ross, who is a painter. I don't know if folks watch Channel 2, PBS. We need a tree here, a bird there. Maybe it's raining over there, but the sun is shining in this corner, in the creation of a beautiful holistic painting. And Kippy is our other Bob Ross. Kippy has funded the entire ecosystem for social impact bonds, from enabling government to provide the technical assistance, enabling the technical assistance social impact bond lab to provide assistance to governments, to intermediaries, to funding our friends at NFF to get the provider landscape ready, to communicating and engaging with different audiences about the promise and also pitfalls of this instrument. So you have been a fierce warrior in this space and building an ecosystem that has been essential to the takeoff of this nascent field. So with that, Kippy, I'll let you introduce your panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. I don't think my mother could have given a better introduction, so thank you for that. So I am Kippy Joseph. I work on the innovation portfolio at the Rockefeller Foundation. And as many of you may know, the Rockefeller Foundation recently celebrated its centennial anniversary. And the foundation's president, Judith Rodin, astutely recognized that it was an opportunity to learn from 100 years of innovation, as well as look forward to what the next 100 years might bring. And when we think about the involvement of the foundation in social impact bonds, not just here in the US, but around the world, the initial reason we got interested is because it sits at the intersection of impact investing and innovation, and it really is the tip of the spear, we think, of a wave of innovative financing instruments that can be put to use for the benefit of society, for the benefit of those who are economically disadvantaged or otherwise vulnerable, and to share in the responsibilities that we all have to take care of one another. So I think that one of the reasons that I'm here in this seat today is because I have the opportunity to talk with these folks and really stimulate a conversation rather than a panel of talking heads. So I want to just make it clear right now to my fellow panelists that I will hopefully be facilitating with a light hand, but in some cases where I need to use an iron fist to make sure that we're having a conversation. Bill?
Reputation is preceding.
Yes, that's right. I will do so. But I also would encourage you to interrupt each other and to really create the kind of debate that we had in our preparation calls and that we know is happening in this space generally. So rather than asking each panelist to introduce themselves and take up the rest of the time with their own introductions of where they sit, I would rather ask you each to state your name and where you work, obviously, but share with us what involvement you have with specific pay-for-success or social impact bond transactions as a way of sharing with our audience what deals are currently in the market and what's in the pipeline. So I'd like to start, I guess, Surya, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind.
Sure. Thank you, Kippy. It's a real pleasure to be here with Bank of America Merrill Lynch. My name is Surya Kolluri. I lead the policy and planning area for Merrill Lynch. And the program that I manage for the organization is broadly ESG, which stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. And so very neatly, social impact investing fits under the S category of ESG. Very privileged to have worked on the New York State deal that we announced end of December. And so as we get into the panel discussion, we'll talk more about that. But when I think about our organization and why we're interested in this, firstly, a large organization like ours moves fast if clients and investors say they want something. And so as we get into the conversation, I'll talk about what is it that clients want that makes us move as fast as we are. And also, from a foundation perspective, Bank of America has a foundation too. We want to think about creating a conversation and build a market. And so there are many elements that go into building this market, hard-earned from the work we did on the deal, and so we'll get into that as well. So both from a building a market and serving the needs of our clients and investors, we have a very strong motivation to get into the space.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Eileen.
Hi, I'm Eileen Neely. I'm with Living Cities, and Living Cities is a collaboration of foundations and financial institutions. And together, our members work to improve the lives of low-income people. And we do that with 3 levers. We think that it's essential for the public sector to be more effective, that capital needs to be used more impactfully, and that people need to work together with using collective impact. And social impact bonds or pay for success or whatever we call it is really the perfect combination of those 3. When we first started looking at it about a year ago, we thought this was a capital innovation. This is a really cool way to use, to attract private investment to address the needs of society. But as we got into it, we really think the more important innovations are around how do we help governments redirect resources toward things that work, and that how we bring these, and I love the words that Jane used, in uncommon partnerships together to address common goals. And so when we introduced the concept of Pay for Success to a broader group of our members, obviously we weren't introducing it to Kippy, but for many of our members who hadn't even thought or heard about Pay for Success or social impact bonds a year ago, the reaction of our members is, we need to put our money where our mouth is. We need to invest in a transaction through our loan fund, because if we're in it, we're going to learn a lot more and we can influence where this goes. So from Living Cities' perspective, with all the ways that foundations can invest, and while we're not a foundation per se, we do act like one sometimes when it's handy, and sometimes we act like a financial institution when that's handy. We decided that our role would be as an investor. And so we invested $1.5 million of subordinate debt into the Massachusetts juvenile justice transaction. And it's subordinate to Goldman Sachs's $9 million primary loan, senior loan, but we're sort of subordinated in addition by $6 million of grants. So we're really sitting in the middle between senior debt and grants. So it gave us a unique perspective.
Great, thank you, Eileen. So we've heard about the two deals that are in the market right now on the state level. There are several other planning grants or planning programs, as well as a transaction in New York City at the city level. But I'm going to ask Bill to go next to share a little bit about how he's been involved with NFF and what's in the pipeline in other big geographies.
Yeah, and NFF is an intermediary in the social sector, connecting nonprofits with capital for 30 years, and we've made a very conscious choice not to be involved in Pay for Success and social impact bond transactions at this point for a very important strategic reason. We don't think it's about social impact bonds and Pay for Success. We think it's about a more underlying secular change in the shift from outputs to outcomes, and preparing a sector for outcomes being really the gateway to all capital, not just Pay for Success capital, but grants, government money, all going to be done through the gateway of outcomes. And so a lot of times we feel as though the discussion around this notion of Pay for Success and social impact bonds is kind of like looking through the wrong end of a telescope. We focus a lot on nitty-gritty details and mechanics and the graphs and the charts and all that. And what we're really looking for is kind of what are the broader sectoral and systemic changes that this is wroughting. And so we focus a lot on that in our work, and have been since the fall of 2010 when we started talking about all of this in the aftermath of the Peterborough transaction. And we focus a lot on building investment readiness, because we think this is all function of an investment mindset that more and more we have to be getting return for the investment into the social sector, both socially and financially. And it's a sector that has a very flaccid musculature for doing those things, and building that is important. And we've done things with our incubators and accelerators to build that capacity among the provider community. And the most recent event we have is this California Pay for Success initiative funded by the Irvine Foundation, which we think in many ways could form a template for how foundations can think about their portfolio of opportunities for building the capacity to make sure that a broad base of not-for-profit organizations have the ability to access capital through this gateway of outcomes. We just compiled the applications from that on Friday, and I just talked to my colleague Jessica LaBarbera in Los Angeles yesterday as they were going through it. We got 36 applications for what are looking to be 3 to 8 spots to develop hopefully 2 transactions within the next 2 years, but all of our work is pre-development. And it's interesting when you divide them up. Among those 36, there's one clear stage 3 ready to rock kind of an organization. And then there are probably 7 or so really strong stage 2s that need a lot more, and then there's kind of everybody else. And what we notice is that the overwhelming majority of philanthropic investment in this space has gone to a very small number of first movers. Okay, terrific organizations that do really, really good jobs, but if all we do is invest in first movers, we're not going to have the systemic impact and the equity that we're looking for all organizations to access capital on this basis. And so I would also mention one other thing, that we are absolutely astounded by the diversity of mission areas that have applied among those 36. Early ed, education, ecology, elder care, foster care, health, homelessness, housing, mental health, and recidivism. And recidivism is tied for the largest interest, along with health and mental health. So it's a very interesting broadening of the landscape in terms of mission areas and opportunities for foundations to be building that currently flaccid musculature in the marketplace. So.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Dave, I want you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit. You have a unique view, being in government and sort of sitting on the balcony and looking over what's been happening all over the country. Could you share a few words about what that's been looking like?
It's been a glorious view from the balcony. Gibby, thank you. So I'm Dave Wilkinson. I'm the White House Senior Policy Advisor for Social Finance and Innovation, and I work in the White House Office of Social Innovation, which is Jonathan Greenblatt's office. And I am the senior policy officer working on Pay for Success and SIBS at the White House. So it's about half of my time. Our sort of core insight is that government's good at funding innovation in some fields. Defense, pharmaceuticals, energy. I see a Department of Energy colleague, Chris Lohman, there. We're not as good at that in the social sector, where we tend to fund towards compliance or outputs. For instance, how many how many beds for the homeless we're creating versus how many folks we are enabling to become sustainably independent. And I know there are a number of federal government folks in the room because I saw the invite list. So I think framing this from a federal government perspective, it can be useful. I think what social impact bonds and pay for success strategies can do is help government overcome both budgetary and sort of political risk barriers to funding innovative solutions. This is primarily around prevention, enabling us to pay only for what works, de-risking innovation, which we tend to be shy about investing in. So our interest in growing this field is strong. The president has consistently put it in his budget. You won't be surprised to see it in the budget that gets released this week. We're enthusiastic about that, and we've been working hard on that. But we also know, and Congress has to pass the budget. Congress doesn't always do exactly what we ask them to do, or on the timeline we want them to do it, surprisingly enough. And so we have our office, Jonathan Greenblatt's Office of Social Innovation, has looked actively for opportunities where funds are flowing, specific grant programs, et cetera, where Pay for Success can enhance those outcomes. So just in the last 3 months, we have connected Pay for Success with 2 major grant programs. Just last week, the president announced the Tiger grants. And so our office worked with, and as well as CEQ, worked closely with the Department of Transportation to ensure that Pay for Success is within the Tiger Grant Program, which is a $600 million infrastructure finance program with a lot of potential and meaningful links to Pay for Success, including there's a significant ladders to opportunity frame. That's the context of, many of you may not have seen the president's announcement. So the ladders to opportunity is the key framing around this cycle of Tiger grants. And there's a lot on environment, particularly around green stormwater infrastructure and resilience, which could be relevant for Pay for Success. We've also worked very closely with HUD to ensure that make pay for success for the first time a permitted and encouraged use within the $5.1 billion of Sandy Community Development Block Grants connected to disaster relief. And if you're wondering what's the connection between pay for success and disaster relief, this is the second round of Sandy resources. And the intention of this round is to build communities back stronger than they were before. And there's a lot in the guidance, the grant guidance around the CDBG funds for supporting low-income communities, job training, health, education. So almost anything that you can imagine is SIBable is appropriate. And so we were able to get these resources out. The experience with the field and the connection, I think, with philanthropy is that we know if 1% of these, for instance, the Sandy funds were used for Pay for Success projects, we'd triple the total federal outlay for Pay for Success. The challenge is, how do we encourage uptake? So it's often the case when the federal government puts dollars out in the field, they're oversubscribed. This was a case where the potential supply was greater than the capacity to receive. So you literally had the White House on the phone calling experts in the field, pointing this out and encouraging uptake. And so the challenge there, as the government federal government can help to supply capital, is right now in the field there's not that many players. They are incredibly talented, but there's limited capacity to pursue all the different opportunities. There's dozens and dozens of state RFPs and RFIs out there, thankfully, to which these guys are responding. There's no industry association to help sort of gin up attention and drive uptake, and there's limited deal pipeline. And there's also a higher degree of difficulty because states and municipalities don't often have a nuanced understanding and the commitment to try something new. So it's harder for these guys than it would be for others. Mm-hmm. So will there be deals? Yes, absolutely. We might increase total federal outlay by 50% or 100% just through the CDBG program, and that's a big accomplishment. But also, it's also clear that we may be leaving some money on the table, and that's where philanthropy, I heard Bill talk about investing in readiness. I think that's where philanthropy can have its sort of biggest value add.
Great. Dave, let's stick with that point, because I think there's one estimate that in the SIB market, there will be $500 million by the end of 2015, which perhaps to some is not a big number, but I think is a big number in respect to what nonprofits are currently used to for their capital costs and their capital endowments. So part of what I think is going on is that this is such a nascent field and such a nascent ecosystem that I want to pick up on what you were saying, Dave, to ask, how can foundations play their part in building the ecosystem beyond what is happening with the investments in specific transactions? So, Eileen, I'm going to turn to you as the foundation representative to hear your thoughts.
So I think what the Irvine Foundation is doing in California by providing pre-development grants is really significant. One of the areas that I would love to see the field go is away from the over-reliance on grants from foundations, and to recognize that the work that happens to build transactions is actually part of the transaction costs and should be viewed that way by investors and by government and by the nonprofits who get involved. And just like in a real estate transaction, when we do architectural and engineering or environmental studies that have to get done before you build the building, when that building gets built, all those costs get incorporated into the entire cost of the development. I think Pay for Success has to move that direction to become less reliant on foundations. And so when we think about funding those early pre-development costs, if we structure them rather than as grants, but as recoverable grants or as forgivable loans, it starts to develop that mindset. And, there's the grant money, whether it comes from government or from foundations, is simply not enough to address all the social ills that we have. And as long as we continue to put grant money in, people will continue to accept grant money. Just like in real estate development, a developer's gap is exactly equal to the grants that are available. It's just it's a mathematically proven formula. And that's the same with the SIB market. And so I think foundations can start to, I think it's important to fund those pre-developments, but if we start to think about them as being recoverable or recoverable grants or forgivable loans, I think that will help move the market.
But Surya, how would an investor feel about paying for pre-development costs as part of a transaction where they're looking to do good but also do well?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I also want to set a bit of a context of the investor mindset to be able to more specifically answer the question. But I was also thinking about the $500 million estimate, Kippy, that you'd given. So I was just thinking I mentioned ESG. On the E side, just last year, we did $2 billion worth of green bonds, and $500 million that we underwrote, and $500 million from Bank of America Treasury, right? That's still E, not regular bonds that we do. And so when we think about social impact investing, we want it to be that way. But the way we should think about this is in terms of innovation cycles, right? So green is out, it's off and running, social impact is right behind it. So, and we have a lot of confidence that we can grow it that way. Investor mindset, so I mentioned this in the beginning. So we did some research last year, and half our clients said that they would like to reflect their values in their investment portfolios. They did not say we want to do a charitable contribution, which they presumably are doing, but in their investment portfolios with us, they wanted to reflect their values. And if you dig into those numbers, the younger the client got, the higher that percentage was. So when you get to millennials, if you did not offer this, they're going to walk. And so if you did a crosstab of younger and wealthier clients, we risk losing them if we don't have a conversation around social impact investing. Now, to answer Kippy's question specifically, what role would a foundation play, and how would an investor think about the role a foundation plays? And when we went through the deal ourselves and we were pitching the deal to clients to have them sign on the dotted line and invest some money in this, the critical success factor in getting them over the line was confidence. That if Rockefeller Foundation, if Robinhood said, yes, we trust the social science, we trust these metrics, that gets the investor over the hurdle because they're passionate about the social cause. They've been used to writing grant checks. But if they can see the metrics and the foundation with their expertise providing that confidence, then they jump over the line. Now, that could reduce as you build the market, but for every new social area that you're investigating, you will need that confidence building. So hopefully, Kippy, that addresses the question directly.
Absolutely, thank you. And Dave, from a government perspective, where do foundations come into play?
Well, I think for building a market, we need to focus on deal flow and investor demand. And I think foundations are critical on both sides. In terms on the deal flow side, it's helping to develop the market, generate pay for success transactions. And so that means building awareness and knowledge and capacity of the key market players, the high-octane nonprofits, the state and local government, the sector infrastructure, such as the intermediaries. And on the investor demand side, I think that's deploying subsidy that is, in some cases, directly invested on the grant level for deal sourcing and transactions costs, but also investments like credit enhancements, sub-debt, success payments. But I think really, and the federal government should focus on this too, but philanthropy is often in a better position to do this. I think to get greater nonprofit and greater philanthropic involvement, we need to come to funders where they are. There's not many meta funders. Rockefeller and some others have been terrific in helping seed this sector, but most funders are within specific sectors. They're in healthcare or criminal justice or the environment or early childhood. and or they're in specific geographies. And so pay for success can be a game changer in each of those fields. And this is also how government is divided, by agencies, by level of government. And so I think if philanthropy is going to help scale this sector, we're going to need to see those funders. I mean, I think the example of early childhood is probably one of the most advanced, where funders are really beginning to see, hey, this could drive the results we want in a significant way. And I think we need more funders to see that.
Right. So part of that sounds like it's education, and I think a key piece of this is recognizing that the social impact bond structure is really only appropriate for a very small slice of the activities and interventions that exist right now in the social sector. So for example, you're never going to fund advocacy through a social impact bond. It's just not, it doesn't lend itself.
Right.
And so we do want to be very clear about that sliver that we're talking about. But nonetheless, I've heard a couple of great phrases today about that sliver. So you just called the nonprofits that were ready to go the high-octane organizations. And Bill, you said those that are ready to rock. So let's think about those that are ready to rock and those that aren't. So if there's a really small number that are ready to go, what is required for an organization to make their interventions SIBable if they're not in that place that Nurse Family Partnership is in?
Yeah, and I'll revert to my other end of the telescope, looking through the small end to the big end, and say it's not so much in our minds a matter of being ready for pay for success in social impact bonds. It's a matter of investment readiness to access capital through outcomes, okay? And I will give you a great story. I was in Hartford last week where Connecticut was hosting a convening much like this to talk about advancing pay for success and SIBs in that state, and had Lily Elkins from Roca tapped in. And Lily made a great comment saying, you know, pay for success probably isn't for you if you can't demonstrate outcomes and don't have data collection, analysis, monitoring, constant improvement, and reporting on your outcomes. Pay for success probably isn't for you if you don't know the full cost of delivering your services. And pay for success probably isn't for you if you don't have the administrative and operational capacity to support those things and scaling up. And my reaction was, well, you got a lot more problems than pay for success if you can't do those three things. And so building that skill set, that capacity, really is what it takes to push folks not only in a position to be able to access capital on the basis of outcomes, but to be a participant in full-fledged pay-for-success social impact bond transactions. And we actually organized our accelerators and incubators around that, and it's really investing in capacity of these organizations in the intellectual capacity to do what's required for data on outcomes, managing the data, reporting on the data, and using the data for constant improvement and to report to the key constituencies. The financial capital to be able to know what your cost of delivering service is, because if you don't know that, you cannot participate in these transactions very well. It is the human capital to build that internal capacity for folks to do this on their own without always having to have an intermediary sit at their side and do these transactions. Because if all we do is bring that to capacity from the outside, you're not building that capacity internally. And last is the investment in the social capital piece, which gets very much overlooked. A lot of the readiness or lack of readiness of organizations is not having established the relationships with government and investors in ways that gather that confidence that they can be looked in the eye by investors and say, I can trust putting my money here and they are going to deliver on the promise. So those are the things that we would focus on, and a lot of times we kind of ask foundations here, you know, like an interesting series of questions. How many of you have strategies and priorities linked to developing capacity to operate in an outcomes-driven environment? How many of you have segmented grantee populations by readiness and designed programs to raise the level of readiness across a continuum for organizations to demonstrate outcomes, to know what their cost of capital is, and to have the operating and administrative capacity to scale up and support those things? How many of you have pooled with other foundations to provide investment capital to invest in the intellectual, financial, social, and human capital to raise up that level of operating within outcomes. And how many of you yet want and expect better outcomes from your grantees at the same time? And that's the challenge, I think, is to look at this so that we don't create this wonderful class of our own one-percenters who can do these transactions and create kind of a revenue and capital disparity, much like the income disparities that we're looking at socially. And that, I think, is the real challenge to again, look through that smaller end of the telescope and think about what we're doing systemically here. Because one thing that social finance did do with this, and I've said it 1,000 times, is this notion of monetizing social impact was an incredible breakthrough. We kind of view it like cavemen with fire. We're a little afraid of it. We don't know how to control it. We don't know what it really means. Can we replicate it again with the 2 stones and make sparks? Do we have the fuel? But when that happened, finding a way to monetize, and it's one way to monetize social capital through prevention and that delta between the prevention and back-end high-cost institutionalized treatment protocols. What it's fomented in our observation in the marketplace is people starting to think about how else can I monetize social impact so I can bring capital into the world's most capital-starved business sector on the universe, the social sector, and the sector that allocates capital most ineffectively currently in terms of generating outcomes. And so we look at it that way, saying use those first movers to get those transactions done, to kind of set the templates and create more transparency so we can create templates, and then make sure that this runs down the continuum in terms of investment readiness.
So I'm conscious of the desire for people to ask questions, both of the panel and hopefully maybe in the room of each other. But I do want to just ask one question about the evolution of foundations' role in the space. And I particularly liked your example of focusing on capacity building for the nonprofits and not just the 1%ers. And I'm curious about the role of the intermediary in that. So I'm wondering if, Surya and Eileen, if you could speak to the value that the intermediary has provided in the development of the transaction, and if you see foundations' role vis-a-vis the intermediary changing as the market evolves.
So I think both social finance and third sector have been essential to the early development of this. They've not only, typically when we think about an intermediary, we think about a go-between. And they are a go-between and have been in these early transactions, but what they've really done is provided technical assistance to everyone involved, including the investors. I don't know if Surya would include that. The way I got up the very steep learning curve was with Tracy and some of her colleagues. And they've provided that technical assistance not only to investors, but to the nonprofits who have been involved, and especially to the governments. And so that role, I think, will continue until Pay for Success becomes more widely known. And I have this weird lens that I think, oh, everyone's talking about Pay for Success, everyone knows about it, and yet people within my own organization have no idea what I'm talking about when I talk about Pay for Success or social impact bonds. And it reminds me that there's a few people who talk about it a lot. And so until it becomes much more universal, I think the role of the intermediaries will be to continue providing that technical assistance, whether they call it technical assistance or not. And foundations continuing to fund that, because providing technical assistance is not free, I think will continue until governments see the value of funding that intermediary as well. I'm not sure what the rest of your question was.
Let's hear from Surya.
So it's one thing to think about this in the abstract, and it's another thing to actually have gone through it for 2 years, as we did, to construct a deal. And so I'm thinking about the deal as I answer this question. So think about the players that have to come together to make this happen, right? So you got the government that's interested in having an impact and reducing costs. We have the service provider who has to provide the service. In the deal that we worked on, it was CEO, Center for Employment Opportunities. We have the investors, and we also have the social scientists who really want to see their social science come to life as you go through this deal. None of these parties speak the same language, literally. And when it comes down to signing a contract, it really comes into relief, right? That they're speaking different metrics, different points of view, different motivations to sign that deal. And it takes an intermediary with the expertise and the passion and the energy that social finance, an organization like social finance has, to stitch these parties together. And you hit many hurdles along the way. And you can't get through the hurdle with all these people speaking different languages. And so I think as we grow this market, the role of an intermediary that focuses on bringing the parties together is very important. Even more important, I think, is the number of social areas are very different. So we heard about early childhood development in the presentation that you made. At the other end, think about elder care and the Alzheimer's crisis that's coming towards us in the country, and all the boomers retiring, and nursing care. Huge demographic issue coming at us. The social science at the two ends of the spectrum, completely different, especially if we compare it with recidivism, asthma. So you can't, at my organization, trying to bring investors to this place, can't be an expert in all of these things. So you need an intermediary and you need subject matter experts to make this happen.
And I want to add on the language issue. So not only do the social scientists and the investors speak different languages, but even within the foundation, and this is touched upon in the paper, but I think it can't be overlooked, is we talk about right now this being a PRI, program-related investment, sort of concessionary loans or concessionary funding from foundations and grants, and eventually moving into the mission-related investments, which is when foundations use their endowment to actually invest in things that make social impact. Those three organizations, the program people, the PRI people, and the chief financial officer or the chief investment officer, all speak with different languages. If you say investment to any of those three groups, the program people think a grant is an investment, which I thought was crazy until I worked at Living Cities. The PRI people think an investment is a low interest loan. And the MRI people think that an investment is one that you make a market rate return. And so even within a foundation, you speak different languages. And I don't think without the program people, the PRI investors are going to be able to do this on their own. It's really a great place to intersect and cross those silos even within a foundation.
Great. Bill, because you've been so good, we'll give you the last word before we open it up for questions.
Very well behaved for me, actually.
You have been, yes.
Yeah, a couple of 3 points on intermediaries. First of all, you look at the curve in this marketplace, and deals, each transaction has come as larger than the last. They're coming closer together. The first one took 23 months, second one 9 months, third one 6 months, last one 1 month. They are increasingly more complicated, and they have gone from the first two transactions having 2 investors each to there being 48 investors in the last 2 transactions. Intermediary capacity is not going to be able to keep up with this curve. Okay, there isn't a, I don't know if you could grow fast enough, the 2 organizations, so that's one issue. The evolution of intermediaries has been very interesting because not only have there been the social finances and the third sectors as the financial intermediaries, but the strong growth of program intermediaries, which I think is a very, very important aspect of this, and the collaboration and coordination between the financial and the program intermediaries, who oftentimes have multi-state footprints, have templates that they can replicate, and are a very important part of the nodes to spread this notion. And the last piece of it is not every foundation has the capacity to even think about how to get involved here. So another class of intermediaries is going to evolve, and that's going to be intermediaries that can deal with pools of foundations where they can outsource some of this capacity to be able to make investments in one of those 4 complete capital areas, or have investment clubs we talked about 3 years ago as a possibility. So I think there's, this is growing way faster and becoming way more complex and way more of a system than we thought it would when we first started. And that's where I think the real role of foundations is to help make sure that the track is built out in front of that engine far enough in advance so that we stay on the rails.
Great. Tracy, do we have time for questions?
I think we do, if our Aspen colleagues will allow us. Absolutely. Fantastic. Both of you gentlemen.
Randall Kempner with the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. My day job is all about emerging markets, and so I'm interested if anyone could comment about the applicability of SIBS and PFS to emerging markets. And I spend a lot of my nighttime thinking about my hometown of Galveston, Texas, and so I'm also interested to know sort of how small can you go? Is there a size that matters, and can, at a county level or a city level, SIBS be utilized?
I can jump in quickly. When we did a market scan recently, we saw about 40 of these around the world. And when we did a tally, it looked like a Olympics table, right? There were 40 with the US having 22, and then the rest of the world, disperses around the rest of the world. But there were some in emerging markets that we noticed. An example of that I learned from your colleagues in the UK is around sleeping sickness. Sleeping sickness in Africa. So disease goes from animals, particularly cattle, to people, and so the intervention is with the animals, and the prevention and the cost reduction is with treating and taking care of people who are afflicted by that. So that's an example. So we've also seen around gender lens oriented. So for example, there was one in India that I read about. Somebody from the SIB lab is kind of driving that around women and education oriented activities. So in fact, we handed off one around affordable housing. I forget where it was, in Central Africa. So there was one inquiry around Mongolia, which we did not, follow through on. But so there are some inquiries that I've seen. But the volume, it's a bit of a exponential curve. Lower volumes in the emerging markets is what I've seen.
Just very quickly to augment that, Surya, we're seeing sovereign SIBs, so the native country pursuing this on its own, as well as DIBs, which we call development impact bonds, which is more about deploying multilateral capital in a foreign aid setting to drive outcomes. So the distinction is that. And we can talk more at the mingling session.
And I'll just say, there was an organization working very hard to develop pay for success in SIBS in the undeveloped world, and we got a call wondering if they could talk to us because they're having a hard time finding providers who are capable of delivering under the pay for success SIB structure, which kind of completes the circle on the theme.
I'll let Jane also have the last word on DIBs because she was at a OSTP White House session on DIBs last week.
DIBs are, as Tracy said, they differ slightly from SIBs in that the ultimate payor is not the sovereign government, but some combination of multilateral organizations like development banks and possibly multinational corporations as well. And there are a number of DIBs in development. My own personal guess is that we will probably see one on the ground in 2014. There isn't one yet, but there are a number that are inching along. They're very complicated to put together, as well as you can expect. But the interesting thing about DIBs is that the constraint there is not investor interest. I think that John Simon will agree with me on this, that there is tremendous investor interest in putting money into these instruments. The constraint is the lack of viable opportunities on the ground to put them in. But we are seeing DIBs at various stages of development, from, as we said, malaria and sleeping sickness to fisheries conservation to reducing teenage pregnancy and improving girls' education rates in the developing world. So this is actually one of the most exciting applications in the market today.
Hi, Albert Watt from the National Governance Association. I work in early child education, but I'm very much a layman in the social impact bond area. So my question, there was a cluster of questions in my head while you guys were talking, and I think it all has to do with what's the end game. So when SIBs go into, let's say, early child education, home visiting, is the sort of the, are we envisioning that SIBs will become a sort of a permanent sort of part of the financing mechanism of that industry, or are we talking about catalyzing more sustainable public investment in that area? And I think what's behind those questions is that I can't, as a layman again, I can't help but notice that most of the SIBs sort of projects are in areas that are traditionally not as well funded, right? So we don't need SIBs in defense because they just don't need it. So at what point are we talking about using SIB to drive, kind of change in the policy and political arenas? So I'll stop there.
And I would just say the other alternative that we should explore is the ultimate goal to hand off to government to fund what it should have been funding all along but couldn't because of political will or legacy programs or whatever, or is the ultimate goal to hand off to private investors and the capital markets and the trillions of dollars that are currently unavailable to fund these kinds of programs but could be in the future with this kind of a vehicle.
Well, I think government has a unique ability to scale solutions when we know that they're working. And I think that SIBs have a tremendous ability to align capital towards clearly defining outcomes so that we learn what works. I think some could argue that it would be silly to try to scale something nationally, an intervention that works, using a relatively complicated and expensive financial structure. And I do think it'll be a little bit, the answer ideally will be a little bit of both.
I've been thinking a lot about this end game, and when I first got involved, I thought the end game is that government sees the logic of funding these preventative interventions up front. And then on my more cynical days, I pick up the paper and read that we're cutting funding for Head Start, even though there's studies that say it saves $7 for every $1 of investment. And I think, yeah, government's not that smart. But I think part of the problem, that's when I at my most cynical. but I think it falls somewhere in between, which is government's not good at holding providers accountable for quality. And so for every great Head Start program, there's one that sucks. And you know which one makes the headlines? It's the one that has its problems. And so then we become convinced that all Head Start is lousy. And so I don't know how we get better about holding providers accountable if government provides the money up front, because government can't then recapture the money from an organization that's already spent it. And so that's where I struggle, and I don't know the answer. I think about, again, I'm going to go to housing. I see two of my former Fannie Mae colleagues in the room, and I'm originally a housing finance person. And I think about the low-income housing tax credits and how inefficient it is, but yet it's held up as the model. And the reason is because there's a way to measure the outcomes with the low-income housing tax credit and hold the providers accountable and basically hold the investor accountable that if the housing isn't built or it's rented to people who aren't qualified or income qualified, then there's some recapture provisions and the investor loses their tax credits. But then I look at public housing, and I worked in public housing authorities. The money's given up front, the housing's built, and if the housing is lousy, the government doesn't know what to do about that. And for every crappy housing authority that makes the headlines, there's 20 fabulous ones who are providing this really important social good in their marketplace. And so I don't know where we fall in that. And so I think we got to continue to not stop doing what we're doing and experimenting because we don't know what that end game is.
No, I want to jump into very quickly on that question. Imagine two pools of capital, government and philanthropic funding on one side, and capital markets, as Kippy said, on the other side. And I just made the point that the folks in the capital markets arena are showing an interest in investing in this space. And there's a huge pool of capital. But that comes with a cost, which is it requires market discipline. It's going to impose market discipline. And so if you view that as a good thing of imposing market discipline on a social area, then that door can be opened up. And there's an evolution taking place as that money begins to trickle in. It's gone from negative screening, saying don't give me that, which is easy to do, to directed investing on social impact. Which is the New York State and the SIB is an example of that. So that door is opening, and the question is, are we ready for the discipline that's going to demand?
Yes, sorry, Tracy,
I will direct it.
You direct.
You in the white face.
We're all being very well-behaved warriors here. I'm Ann Mosley. I'm a vice president here at the Aspen Institute. In my past life, I was at the Kellogg Foundation and co-led our $100 million primarily market rate investment. And so, one, I just want to say that thank you for this report. I think it's fantastic. We've been doing a lit review on the partnership work we're doing with Jane, and I think this is one of the freshest pieces out there. And the comments, sort of want to do some comments and almost an invitation as well as commenting. But, Tracy, when you opened about it being a delicate experiment, I think that's really important. I mean, at Kellogg, we try to be really careful because the headlines are really about better outcomes for vulnerable populations and communities and increased flow, better use of capital. And those are North Stars that we all kind of embrace. And we get excited at different times, or we have long-term challenges. And so I just think, and Rockefeller has curated a very careful policy kind of, sort of environment and conversation. And so it was just really exciting to sort of read the reports. I just want to say a big thank you, because when Surya outlined the challenges that he faces in his work thinking about the language gaps, those are cultural gaps between the social scientists, the market forces, the financial institutions, the government. It's very different, and they're really cultural. And so I think how we keep moving forward about the right North Star tools. And Bill, your comment about the capacity pipeline challenges, I'm sort of left with a couple questions when we think about, I think, Surya, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how flexible is that market discipline over a 5-year, 10-year period, sort of saying, because that will be the lever that takes it out of like the philanthropic kind of club and community, which is very powerful and has lots of opportunities. But you're at that sort of spot of scale. And how patient are you for sometimes inefficient conversations, or like how do we sort of keep bridging those cultures, and then with the private sector, and then on the philanthropy side and for social finance and others, all these conversations that they're about outcomes, but then and pay for success, SIBs are one tool of that. They ripple out, like we're deeply involved with Albert. I loved your question, of course, but thinking about early childhood. And so we're trying to bring the SIB conversation into our broader policy. We're trying to embed that into our early childhood policy conversations. Help, but and like when I think about some of the early health work, because they need to be connected. And so I'm curious about any other thoughts you have where these kind of conversations challenge what has been traditionally good thinking, just some program strategy where we sit to being actually really excellent strategy. So I put a lot in there, and forgive me, but first I want to say huge compliment, because this is a very helpful tool. And how do we think about the conversations that can go more broadly into the field, and then how, are you going to lead the market forces, Surya?
So the question is, how patient are we going to be about building this market? As long as our clients want this, we're going to be patient, right? So that's kind of a clear answer. For us, the North Star is clients and what clients want, and as long as clients want that, we're going to be driving on this. But we're also, I think all of us are smart in the sense that we come down the learning curve pretty fast. So even after the first deal, we have said, what are the lessons learned? across what were the challenges that we hit. Could we create a playbook? Could we create a SIB playbook? Could we come up with language that each party that participates in this can understand, but it comes from a common basis? So I think we're going to come down the efficiency curve pretty fast.
Yeah.
The question is, can we create a category of demand? So for example, Jane was talking about the conference upcoming in March on the topic of early childhood development. That is an example of generating demand from states, right? Then you're building the category. So you build the category and you do a couple of deals, you start coming down the learning curve. But what I can't predict is for each social science area, what is the length of it? What's the T in the x-axis, right? How long is that? That's an open question.
That's great.
I think this notion of spread that you asked is really, really important, because I think one of the other things about the collateral benefits of pay for success and social impact bonds is the way it's put a bright shining light on all of these issues we've been talking about here. And I do more than just pay for success and social impact bonds. And I'm involved in a project in New York called the New York City Change Capital Fund, which is very interesting. You know about this. And what they've done is taken a consortium of 12 foundations who have funded community development corporations to basically build more units of affordable housing, and converted the whole strategy to addressing the intractable poverty in the neighborhoods that these guys serve, and to change the business model to make it more focused on addressing those outcomes of lifting people out of poverty, with the very express notion that they have to have a band of outcomes that measure that properly, that are to folks, and that can position them down the road to do social impact bonds and pay for success transactions. So talk about that continuum, and that to me is a dramatic systemic change in the way a sector thinks about itself and the way donors in the sector think about themselves and what it is they do. Are they in? Are they out? And it's a great reflection, I think, of folks abandoning what I call the binary trap here. We used to do this, now we're going to do that. And some of the biggest mistakes that have been made in that, falling into that binary trap, and thinking more about how do we balance the portfolio of what it is that we do as foundations to support what's happening with this.
Right.
So.
If I could just say on that portfolio point, so Rockefeller has spent the last 3 years working on the ecosystem to appropriately test this new vehicle, the social impact bond, and now we feel like along an innovation curve and taking into account a portfolio approach, we are now ready to start integrating SIB strategies into our existing funding initiatives in livelihoods, in cities, in health, and in ecosystems. So, along with the DIB, we might be seeing a RIB, a resilience impact bond, and we might be seeing an IB, an environmental impact bond. And so, I think that there are ways to think about this with a portfolio approach that allow us to get out of that trap.
I think that's incredibly exciting. Just to add on to that, someone talked about sort of what's the end game, and I think one end game is this vision of a more outcomes-driven nonprofit and social services sector. And we talked about the 1%ers and how we think about building broader nonprofit capacity. And I think one question is, how many people in the room are from direct social service nonprofits that are That's good. That's a good number. But it's a significant minority of the people in the room, notwithstanding that it's the majority of the people who work in the sector. And I think something that we need to remember is that it's the nonprofits that are the ones that are in the trenches. They are the individuals that are taking the greatest risk for the least reward, and they are passionate about the outcomes. And in order to achieve the outcomes, they need resources. And they are very practical about how they get those resources in the door. And the question is, what do we reward them for now? We don't reward our nonprofit service providers for outcomes. We reward them for other things, for relationships, for connections, for snazzy marketing, for compliance with grants, for ability to navigate governmental and philanthropic, arcane bureaucratic structures, rather than the outcomes. So the fact that Rockefeller and hopefully others are funding and rewarding nonprofits, there's nothing nonprofit service providers would prefer than to be funded and rewarded for actually achieving outcomes rather than spending all this time, being friendly to donors and government bureaucrats.
Well, we have time for 2 quick questions, and to you.
Thanks. My name's Barry Zegas. I'm one of the 2 former Fannie Mae people that Eileen referred to, and I've spent a lot of time with the low-income housing tax credit. I make 3 quick points. One, thanks for convening this. Second, I recommend to people the San Francisco Fed's paper that's listed in the bibliography because it's got a great review. And to Eileen's point about, I wanted to just go a little further on the low-income housing tax credit and what that has taught us about this particular kind of investing, especially as it relates to intermediaries. The program is almost 30 years old, and in the nonprofit domain, intermediaries run the table. Right? They haven't disappeared, they haven't been replaced, they play a huge role, and they had a lot of important startup capital from foundations to start playing that role, right? To introduce investors to the concept, to discipline the field and pick the right people to do it and impose standards that have become industry-wide. But they've also now they developed very quickly their own model of how to get paid to an earlier point as part of the transaction. So I would urge those foundations who are thinking about this to look at the evolution of that program, not as a perfect template, but as an example of how this migrated in many ways without any of this thinking going on. Right? We created this gigantic resource and then we had to figure out how to use it. But I think there are some lessons that are worth taking from that.
Really important. Last question.
So in my nighttime stuff, I do a lot of work with data scientists for social good. And one of my big questions that I saw in the white paper was on getting nonprofits ready for data and getting nonprofits ready for the evaluation part, because as a person who funds nonprofits but also works with groups of nonprofits to try to improve their data, do data standardization, you have this competing things where foundations will ask for one thing is in one standard, government asks for another thing is another statement, and even though you have nonprofits who are doing really good work, they can't prove it because the data isn't ready, the platforms we're working with don't compete with each other, and they just don't really have people who can bring it all together because they're out in the field trying to do work. So I was wondering if people could talk about that a little bit.
I want to be respectful to our Aspen hosts, and we're already 15 minutes late, so I'll answer that question in a very succinct way by acknowledging that there is a challenge around disclosure, around transparency of data, around harmonizing different data sources, around potentially, the policy lever is the government mandating the use of data after they have articulated a codified set of data standards. So we're 100% with you that data is a challenge. That said, social impact bonds and pay for success, the backbone is around data. Without data, without metrics, none of this could exist. And we're hopeful that this tool could enable and lift the data discussion to new light. I hope that we can continue. Yes.
Can I just say also that folks should interested in this, should look at the federal budget that's being released today about potential resources available to facilitate access to administrative data.
Fantastic.
And the data issue is also an issue among the governments who are getting involved in this, not only the nonprofits. The governments, this will require silo busting within the governments, and one of the biggest challenges in that silo busting, it's one thing to go down to the hall and say, okay, now I'm willing to talk to somebody in a different agency, but to have data that can be shared among what seems, at first glance, seems to be very similar agencies with similar end goals has been a huge challenge. And if governments start to address that and never do a social impact bond, we are better off. So I think that's part of the end game, is getting people to talk to each other.
And one last point on data is that is actually one of the 4 thrusts of the Impact Investing Task Force established by the G8 that Jonathan's office has been stewarding, and it's one of the 4 thrusts that all these countries are trying to wrestle with together, harmonizing and codifying metrics. So with that, I hope that, Tracy, you will allow us to continue the conversation out there. I'd also like to acknowledge several of my colleagues who are in the room, and please approach them. Nirav Shah in the back, Rebecca Leventhal, Casey Tracy Littlefield, Gary Palacier, and all of us are just so grateful for all of you coming on such a treacherous day. And here's to going out into the world and talking beyond this echo chamber, reaching new audiences together to live up to the promise of what this tool could bring about. So thank you so much for being with us.